Hello, and welcome to today's virtual Hinckley Forum. The Hinckley Institute of Politics is a nonpartisan institute at the University of Utah. The Hinckley provides an array of transformative experiences for students through internships, forums, and classes. Hinckley forums seek to foster public discourse and civil debate on the most current and pressing issues, bringing in local, national, and international thought leaders. This forum is presented in partnership with the University of Utah Political Science Department and Alumni Association. We would like to thank our streaming sponsor, AARP Utah, for making our virtual forums this fall possible. And we would also like to thank our media sponsor, KCPW, for recording and rebroadcasting our forums as part of the Hinckley Radio Hour. Today's forum is the Vice Presidency. We are joined by panelist Jim Curry, Associate Professor for the University of Utah Political Science Department, Juliet Carlisle, Associate Professor for the University of Utah Political Science Department, and Boyd Matheson, Opinion Editor for Deseret News and KSL radio host. And of course, our moderator, Jennifer Napier-Pierce, award-winning journalist and former editor of the Salt Lake Tribune. If you have questions for our panel, please enter them into the YouTube chat. We will address questions once we have completed the moderated panel discussion. And with that, I will turn the time over to our moderator.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thanks to the Hinckley. Welcome, everybody. We're talking about the topic of the week, the Vice Presidency. And so we're going to get you all ready for the big debate on Wednesday here at the University of Utah. Let's start with a little bit of the historical context. Professor Curry, what was the founder's vision of the role of the Vice President?
So perhaps the most important thing to lead with on that is that the founders didn't put a whole lot of thought into the vice presidency. The vice presidency wasn't discussed or debated at the Constitutional Convention. It wasn't really something that was a primary concern. To the degree that they created a vice presidency, they did so for two reasons. One was that basically if the president died or resigned or was incapacitated, there would be somebody to step in, though that idea was relatively not clarified at the time and indeed remained controversial until the 1840s when we had to have a vice president step in for the first time officially. But the second reason potentially was because of the electoral college structure. If you know enough about the electoral college, you know that one of the rules in the original design that exists today is that electoral college electors vote for two people, and they have to be from two different states. And so before the 12th Amendment, the founders, the way it worked was that you would just cast two votes for president. You didn't distinguish between president and vice president. You just cast two votes. And they had to come from two different states. And the founders did that because they thought at some level or at some point that electors would simply just vote for someone from their own state. And so that second vote was there to force people to vote for somebody else from another state to try to broaden the reach, try to get to somebody who had some sort of national reputation. And then they used those sort of two votes essentially to get a first and second place winner, and the second place winner would be vice president. But that's about as much thought as was put into the office. Otherwise, it was just essentially a placeholder.
And Professor Carlisle, I guess in 1800, things got a little more complicated and we found ourselves with the 12th Amendment. So can you explain what the 12th Amendment is?
The 12th Amendment. Well, I didn't know we'd be talking about amendments today.
Oh, sorry.
No, I can't tell you about the 12th Amendment.
Okay.
I can tell you about the 12th Amendment if you'd like.
Broad strokes.
Yeah.
So the 12th Amendment is essentially a change to the electoral college structure, where prior to the election of 1800, like I said, you had two votes for electoral college electors. Both of them were for president, and whoever got the most votes became president. Whoever got the second most votes became vice president. In the election of 1800, Jefferson and his unofficial running mate, Aaron Burr, got the exact same number of votes in the electoral college because all the good Republican electors voted once for Jefferson and once for Burr, but there was nothing to formally distinguish who became president and vice president. So Congress had to decide, and there was all sorts of chaos with some Federalists and some allies of Burr trying to push him past Jefferson in the House of Representatives. And so as a result, very quickly, Jefferson and his allies in Congress added a new amendment or pushed forward a new amendment that would have the electors distinguish between their vote for president and their vote for vice president, and that became the 12th Amendment.
Okay, great. Boyd Matheson, I see your picture showing up. He's the opinion editor at the Deseret News, also with KSL News Radio, and just jumping off the radio to join us. Boyd, welcome.
Hey, great to be with you. I ran from the first floor to the fifth floor, and great to be with everybody. I've already learned something from James, so we're off to a great start.
We were just talking about the evolution of the vice presidency and how things have sort of shifted from what the founder's vision was. Do you have any historical fun facts you'd like to throw into the discussion, Boyd?
Well, I think one of the really interesting things for me anyway is, as the vice presidency evolved, it really, the original job was really to preside over the Senate. And there were a few vice presidents who weren't really interested in the legislative process and didn't enjoy sitting on the bench there while the members of the Senate debated things. And so it became more of a kind of a ceremonial role, and they kind of passed that off. I actually have been saying for years for both the Democrats and the Republicans, if they really wanted to move an agenda, they should have the vice president go sit in the chair in the Senate and demand all the senators be there all day long and debate, vote, amend, and do it again in front of the American people. So that's kind of my hope where we end up.
All right. You talked about ceremonial positions. I found two quotes when I was doing the research. Thomas Marshall, who was VP under President Woodrow Wilson, said, "Once there were two brothers. One ran away to sea, the other was elected vice president of the United States, and nothing was heard of either of them again," which I loved. I thought that was great. And then the second one was Harry Truman, who was FDR's third vice president, as history buffs will note. He famously said the job of the vice president was to go to weddings and to funerals. So Professor Carlisle, do you see the vice presidents as pretty ceremonial? Do they have more heft in governing today? And what are those specific duties that are laid out for the vice president right now? Boyd mentioned president of the Senate, and we can talk about that straddling. But, what is in the vice president's column right now?
So, yeah, I think that we have seen the historical position of the vice presidency certainly evolve, in large part because the expectation of what the executive branch does. The president now comes in with his or her own agenda. They come in with a list of policies, and it's the expectation by the American people is that the president will have a hefty role in policymaking. As such, the vice presidency also has taken a greater role. I mean, I think one of the great sort of handoffs we saw is with Al Gore and Clinton. And Clinton gave Al Gore sort of a wide variety of responsibilities, probably more than a lot of historical vice presidents. And so we've seen that carried out throughout subsequent presidencies. There have been a lot of speculation, in particular, that with the age of the current candidates, that the role of the vice president is going to have exceeding importance because of their advanced age. But typically the role of the vice president is to do a lot of fundraising for the ticket. And so that's still pretty prevalent, but certainly the role in policy making. Again, Al Gore sort of was handed off the environment as one of his policy areas. And so we've seen that sort of follow suit in subsequent presidencies.
Boyd mentioned the role as the president of the Senate. Professor Curry, I'm curious about how you view the vice presidential relationship to the Senate, and when does the role of the Senate president really come into play? How have we seen that?
Well, these days it's only a relevant role under very specified circumstances, one of which is what's in the Constitution. What remains relevant is that the vice president is allowed to vote to break ties in the Senate. So in situations where you have a tightly controlled Senate with perhaps the president's party having just enough seats to have a majority, or in the case of the George W. Bush administration, the first couple of years where it was literally a 50-50 tie, Dick Cheney spent a lot of time in the chamber casting tie-breaking votes. Mike Pence has done a good amount of that since the Republicans have had fairly narrow Senate majorities during his time. But you might also use the vice president to preside over the chamber for very specific procedural changes, things like the nuclear option, which have been used to lower end of debate thresholds essentially in the Senate on nominees. You'd bring the vice president in to help preside over that motion, because it just makes the whole process a little bit smoother. But it's become a fairly rare thing. And it's the vice president doesn't have to spend time hanging around the Senate chamber, because they tend to know when the vote's going to be close and when they might need the VP, and just make sure that they schedule everything so he can be there.
Boyd, we talked a little bit about the vice president as a policy maker with that person's own agenda, but they still are second fiddle to the person who's on top running as president. I imagine there's some art and some science to making that vice presidential pick, somebody who's strong enough to stand on their own, to rally the troops and raise money, and to also do some stuff, but willing to take the back seat when it's completely appropriate. Can you talk about the strategy of picking your running mate? And geography is certainly in that mix, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I think one of the most important things that people look at, that they have to look at, let's look at those who might accept the role of vice president. They do have to recognize that there's only one name on the door when it goes into the Oval Office. And it is the president. And so they do have to be subservient that way and kind of check their ego at the door. And there has been a lot of good done by vice presidents over the years in terms of a lot of the negotiating and even a little arm twisting in terms of getting policy agendas through. And so you do have to have, as you said, art and science. It's a delicate dance between having someone who adds value, a president who has a vice president who is just going to go along to get along is useless. They need someone to press against and to even expand and kind of look around the corners for things that the president inside the Oval Office may not be seeing. So that's a real critical thing to keep in mind. Geography tends to play in there as well. You think of Kennedy and needed some help in Texas, so that was a significant play there. In most of them, of course, it doesn't really amount to much. There haven't been very many great vice presidential debates, but there's been some good one-liners, but none of them have really moved the needle. Most people remember the Lloyd Bentsen, the zinger at Dan Quayle, in terms of he knew Jack Kennedy and Quayle was no Jack Kennedy. And while it may have been a line for the ages, they still lost in a landslide. 40 states went to Bush-Quayle. So interesting things in terms of geography. In the end, how impactful it is pretty suspect.
Professor Carlisle, look at the two vice presidential candidates that we'll be hearing from this week. What do you think each of them brings to their ticket?
Certainly, Pence brings experience. He served as vice president for 4 years already. He has had a long career in politics. And so there's that experience. Kamala Harris also has experience, probably a little less on the national stage, only arriving at the Senate in 2017. But she had experience in public service. With Kamala Harris, I think one of the most important factors is her gender and her race and ethnicity. I mean, she's a woman of color. And so this adds a particularly novel dynamic to the vice presidency. It hopefully for the Democrats will mobilize women and people of color, and also focus the agenda of Biden, should he be elected, to some of the issues that not only women, but people of color, but also younger generations. She's younger than Biden, and so she brings youth to the ticket.
Let's talk about the gender issue. Kamala Harris is the third woman to be a vice presidential candidate for a major party ticket. And it has, in the past, when women have, I'm assuming it was part of the appeal was to appeal to those women voters out there. Did it work in the previous two instances, Professor Carlisle?
Yeah, I think, we could talk about Geraldine Ferraro, and I think, I don't know that she attracted any more women to the ticket. Certainly, Senator Palin probably, I think there's some controversy about her and sort of her sort of personality and characteristics and her knowledge and experience. And I think the hope was by Republicans that because Clinton didn't win the nomination for the Democrats, that Democratic women might jump over and support a woman, that women will automatically support women. And that's not the case. We don't see that women automatically supporting women. There's other things like party identification that come into play. There's also issues that come into play. But I think one of the interesting things about this election is, in particular, the force of women who came out in 2018, sort of against Trump, and they really led that blue wave. And he's been characterized by many as sexist and misogynist, and so it's really mobilized women in a different way. And so I think there's a possibility that women are still really motivated to turn out. And so, maybe it'll get people, sort of off the bench and into the polls, but whether it'll attract women from the right, that's hard to say.
Professor Curry, do you want to jump in on the gender question?
To a degree, just to say that, Kamala Harris's selection and the fact that she is a woman and also a non-white woman really fits with what we know about who presidents selected their vice presidents. And both Boyd and Juliet both touched on important aspects of who the president selects to be their vice president. I mean, historically, as Boyd pointed out, it's largely been about sort of balancing the ticket, especially with geography in mind. But and that was true for most of American history up through the 1960s, really, because up through that period, vice presidential candidates were not selected really by the president himself or the presidential nominee, but by the party leaders. The conventions would meet, they would select a president sometimes after multiple ballots because there was no clear front runner. And then the party elites would sit and think, okay, who needs to go along with this person in order to keep our party unified? In the Democratic Party for a long time, that meant they would nominate a Northerner to run for president, and then they would give him a Southerner to be their vice presidential nominee. And you often saw a similar sort of regional balance with the Republican Party at the same time, or often, even had the traditional moderate versus less moderate president and VP to keep people happy. It's only really been since Jimmy Carter that the vice presidential selection has been something that's involved the presidential candidate, him or herself. Jimmy Carter, a characteristic of Carter's very personalized approach to the office, decided when he won the Democratic nomination that he wanted to play the leading role in deciding who the VP was. And so he wanted somebody that he could work with, and Walter Mondale ended up being somebody who was a good personal fit from Carter. Going forward from there, it's really been about both of those things together. You want somebody who reflects a part of the party that maybe the nominee doesn't well reflect, and you want somebody that can also work well with the president. And you see this very clearly with Harris, right? Joe Biden is an older white man in a period where we spent the entire Democratic nomination talking about how the Democratic Party is too old, or about how non-white voters and female voters have become a larger, more substantial part of the Democratic coalition. At the same time, she's also a senator, which is something that is near and dear to Joe Biden's heart, and sort of essentially what he views as how you should go about policymaking and lawmaking in Washington. So it's a very natural fit, and it fits with everything we know that Joe Biden ended up selecting a female non-white senator to be his running mate, the same way that Donald Trump chose somebody in Mike Pence, who in a lot of ways was his opposite and who had the opposite strengths. He was an evangelical Christian who identified very strongly politically as an evangelical Christian and could be that sort of outreach to that part of the party that Donald Trump clearly didn't reflect very well. And he had long, deep ties in Washington and in the Washington policymaking community from his time in the House of Representatives, and also then later through his very close relationship with Paul Ryan, who was Speaker of the House at the start of Trump's term. So you can see through both Harris as well as Pence how this mixture of what's good for the party's coalition and what's good for me personally as the president has become the dominating roles or the dominating considerations in who gets selected.
Boy, you certainly have something to say on this. I mean, does the VP pick really matter on election day? It doesn't seem to sway votes. So what is the significance of this person?
Yeah, again, historically, I don't know that it has ever really determined the outcome of election. It just doesn't seem to have that kind of sway. I think this year may be a tipping point in that, as was mentioned by Professor Carlisle, that with the age of both of the top of the ticket members in Joe Biden and President Trump, both being 73 plus, also with the recent health of the president, that these two nominees for vice president suddenly are very relevant and very important in terms of both stabilizing their political bases to make sure, hey, there's going to be a steady hand at the helm and a positive influence, regardless of what the health of the president might be. Also, they need to demonstrate that they have a policy vision and agenda. Again, it often becomes subservient to the president. But I think voters want to know, how do you think? How do you make your decisions? And so I think one of the things we'll probably see on Wednesday is that you will see them carving out how they think, what principles guide them in terms of decision making. And even just listening to Senator Harris's comments over the weekend, the op-ed she ran today, very clear that she understands that people are looking to her as a force on the ticket. She's not just there as a free pass or a filler, but they actually have to be people who are going to motivate people to, I don't know if we even have to get off the bench. We just have to get off the couch and go to the kitchen table to cast a vote this year. So she's going to play that role, and Vice President Pence is going to show that he is a policymaker. He has the relationships. He can get an agenda done. So I think both of them are going to kind of carve out those spaces in what I do think will be probably the most influential vice presidential picks we've probably ever seen.
Professor Carlisle, I mean, it is interesting to sort of look through the lens. And do you see this as a natural evolution? Do you think that the future of the vice presidency will change fundamentally because of what we're seeing in 2020?
I mean, I think we've sort of been on that trajectory. As I stated earlier, you know, we've certainly seen an increased role in what the vice president does. But I think also, you know, one of the things to think about is the executive branch is one of probably the most masculine branches in the government. Not a lot of women have made it to these upper echelons of government, to these cabinet positions. Certainly that's evolved a little bit, and we've seen increasing numbers of women placed in sort of these interior cabinet positions, Secretary of State, for example. But yeah, I mean, I think so. I think when we think about the role of women, I mean, there's a couple of caveats. When we think about the role of women and the fact that women are increasingly dominating in law school and business school graduates, this leads to their pipeline into office. A lot of office holders come from these jobs, right? And so when we have more women in these professions, it's a springboard into office and even higher levels of office. Also, the choices of women, you know, to work outside the home, excuse me, even when they have children, right, is becoming increasingly the norm. And so I think those sort of roles we're sort of accepting more. Still, it is a very masculine office. So there's some gendered expectations about what a lot of these positions should be like, our own biases towards them. But another thing that's worth mentioning is that during the pandemic, we've seen that women have left the workforce at significantly higher rates than men, and women of color as well. So what a lot of people are suggesting is that despite all these gains that women have made in the professional world, in jobs and livelihoods and careers, and really paving ways, that this is going to set women back. A lot of women are shouldered with the double burden, taking care of their young children without daycare or school options. And so oftentimes, because they make less than a man, their jobs are seen as more willing to be sacrificed, right? And so if one parent has to stay home, the lower wage earner will, and generally that's a woman. And so what that does in the long run for politics, we can't say, but it's curious to see what could possibly happen down the road. Are we going to lose women in these upper level positions? Are we going to lose a generation of high achieving women that sort of can springboard into these higher levels of government?
That's a really interesting perspective. We have a lot of questions coming in from our students already, so I sort of want to weave in and out some of those. This is, how do presidential tickets reconcile differences in political ideology? Are there examples in history when the VP and the president disagreed to an extreme level? Professor Curry, do you have any examples of where there's this dichotomy of ideologies, and how'd that play out?
Well, usually there is, in part because for most of American history, presidential and vice presidential nominees were selected because they came from opposite wings of their party. And the reality is we have a two-party system, which means even today, where we talk about the parties as more unified than they have been in the past, there's still big tent parties that bring in people from different backgrounds and with different interests and with different policy goals. I mean, the most obvious example of a president and vice president who didn't agree on anything would have been Adams and Jefferson pre-12th Amendment, where they were literally the leaders of their opposing parties. That's an extreme example, but you could think about a number of examples throughout American history where presidents and vice presidents might have been in sharp disagreement. Lyndon Johnson and Hubert Humphrey disagreed completely over the Vietnam War during their 4 years together. Clinton and Gore had a lot of relatively low profile disagreements during their time in office. I have to imagine that Obama and Joe Biden also disagreed about a number of things. The key when you're the president is just that the vice president doesn't vocalize those things publicly. I mean, you want to make sure they are essentially what we think about as in Washington as a team player, that if they have disagreements, they bring them up privately. They try to push the president in their direction. But when once the decision is made, the vice president is on board and stays on board. And so in a way, the president and vice president work the way that parties work generally in our government, and that the parties essentially work internally to try to reconcile their intra-party disagreements and move forward with about as unified of a front as possible. And you see that in action where the president and vice president might debate and discuss and probe each other personally in the Oval Office, but when a decision is made by the president about how they're going to move forward, it's kept under wraps.
Boyd, you spent a number of years working on Capitol Hill. Did you hear that insidery gossip of, the president and the vice president bickering about some policy issue?
Yeah, it definitely comes out. And as Professor Curry mentioned, you do have some of those. Hopefully, they're more private than they are personal and played out in the public. And but I think the real key to that, again, if you look at the Obama-Biden relationship, they often ended up on different approaches when it came to foreign policy. And Joe Biden disagreed with President Obama on a host of foreign policy decisions, big ones. But it's one of those things where you have to recognize that it's not about 100% consensus. It's about 100% support once the decision is made. And again, having a vice president that is okay with that, that is comfortable voicing, and the best administrations are always the administrations that have big, open, roiling debates on decisions. But then once the decision is made, everyone marches forward, doesn't do it through back channels and leaks to reporters. One interesting thing around that I think we've seen in the current administration is with President Trump being very transactional in nature. That's why I think there are so many leaks that come out of that particular White House. where you had people in the Obama administration and George W. Bush. They were fiercely loyal based on relationships. So the relationship with the vice president, the relationship with the key members of the staff made it so there were far fewer leaks coming out of those critical decision makings than there have been in the current administration.
Here's another question from the audience. How common is it for vice presidents to later run for president? How often do they win? Is the vice presidency the best seat to hold to later become a president? Or do senators, governors, others have a higher record of becoming president? Maybe toss it to Professor Krylell. Oh, and Professor Curry has something to add too.
Yeah, I don't know what the statistics are. Jim might know that off the hand, but certainly there's some advantages, right? You've served at this high level of office. You have a lot of name recognition, but also you've probably been a team member to an administration that has made decisions that have, half of the country hasn't liked. And so you have to convince a great number of people that you're separate, that you have your distinct positions. And that can be really hard to do, to separate yourself from your predecessor, the one, with whom you served. That can be a real challenge. Certainly people with state level office, people who come from the Senate, people who come from governorships, again, usually garner a lot of name recognition that's very helpful to their tickets. Coming from the House is a lot more difficult, especially because the House is oftentimes a little bit more, you're sort of beholden to a much smaller constituency. And so your decisions that you make in the House might be a little bit more extreme than sort of moderated.
Professor Curry.
I can give some data on this. I sketched this out right beforehand because I'm anticipating this might get asked. So, I mean, Juliet is absolutely right? Like, it's the vice presidency can be a great stepping stone to the office, but it can be a liability too. It's best of a stepping stone if the guy you're working for dies or resigns. Essentially, we've had 48 vice presidents and 14 of them have become president at a later time. That's about 29%. But 9 of those 14 became president through death or secession, basically resignation of a president. 8 of them because the president died, and then 1 in Gerald Ford because Richard Nixon resigned. Only 5 vice presidents have outright won the presidency at a later time. And even that's a little misleading because one of those is Thomas Jefferson, who again ran against the sitting president. So essentially you have 4 presidents who ran for president as a successor to their president, to a president that they served and eventually won. And even one of those folks, Richard Nixon, lost it before he eventually won. And so it can help you. It puts you in the national picture. And you can see this with the comparative stuff. The question asked, the vice president versus senators versus governors. Again, there have been 14 vice presidents who became president. There have been 16 senators and there have been 17 governors. Now, some of those people fit in multiple categories, but it's in relatively equal proportion. What you can pretty much be guaranteed is if you're vice president and you survive being vice president and you want to be president, you're going to have some sort of leg up in running for the nomination, in the sense that you're going to be, if not the front runner, one of the front runners in the future for the presidential nomination. But that's no guarantee you win. In fact, vice presidents running for president have lost the nomination more so than they've won it.
Boyd, do you think being vice president is a liability or an asset for Joe Biden?
I don't think it's going to play out as a major asset. There is enough leftover goodwill and good feeling, I think, in the party from the Obama administration that I think it did help there, especially in the middle of a pandemic. I think it sort of said, well, we had a good 8-year run. Joe was a good player there. And so we trust him. We know who he is. And so I think that helped, again, in the nomination process. In terms of the general election, I don't think there's any real advantage there. Again, as divided as the country is on that, it's so close that it doesn't seem to really be moving the needle one way or the other. With the exception, and I think this is an interesting one for us to watch, is there were so many voters in 2016 who voted for President Trump based solely on the Supreme Court. one of those rare single issue voters like we haven't seen very often. Many of those voters over the last 4 years have either become exhausted and exasperated with the president and with politics in general, that they've sort of disconnected and may not even vote come November. And some have drifted towards Joe Biden. And so it will be interesting to see if there are, again, fond memories of the Obama administration that might cause them to drift that way, or if things like the Supreme Court and how the Democrats and Republicans go to battle in hearings in the coming weeks may actually reawaken some of those voters. So that part's going to be just fascinating to me.
Yeah.
If I can add something too, I think that in terms of this particular election, Biden, who he is, I think is an asset, considering the environment in which this election is being held. He is running really as perhaps a healer in chief, right? He's somebody who has a long career, and sometimes that's disadvantageous to somebody. They're seen as an insider, part of the swamp. But I think he's pulling on the idea that, listen, I've never been at the extreme. I'm somebody you can trust. I'm somebody stable. Not only that, you have a large proportion, I can't tell you the numbers, Jim, but the numbers of folks, the Lincoln Project, the Never Trumper Republicans, people in high levels of visibility who have come out, Republicans who have come out and endorsed Biden. That's really not something we typically see. So in a lot of ways, his connection to Obama and Obama's popularity probably isn't a liability at all. I think there's still a lot of fondness for sort of these normal times. And I think that will really serve him well.
Professor Curry, you had something to add?
Yeah, I mean, to some degree, I largely agree with Juliet on that point. From a campaign strategist standpoint, what you would try to do to your opponent is try to redefine your opponent, especially if you're behind. So if you're a Trump campaign strategist, you would want to try to label Joe Biden in a way that would be unflattering to him, redefine him in a way that makes him less popular. The fact that he was vice president for 8 years, and a relatively popular vice president from public opinion polling, more so than his two predecessors, probably makes that a harder job, because he's not somebody who isn't known among the American public, at least the voting public. He's somebody who's very well known among the voting public, about as well known as anybody who hasn't been president among the American voting public. And so that makes it a lot harder for the Trump campaign or any of the Trump campaign's allies to try to recast Joe Biden in a certain way. He kind of is who he is, and there's not much you can do about that.
And I would just add, Jennifer, real quick to that, because I think that those are all really important. And I think one other advantage that Joe Biden had coming in is that he did have a 4-year sort of breather. There was an exhale moment from the Obama administration. Often you have that sequence and people think, okay, is 12 years with one party and 2 candidates, is that really the best thing? So there's sort of a fatigue factor that I think Joe Biden was very wise when he left the office of vice president, that he did step back, he did some different things, and then began to rebuild and emerge. So again, especially in a pandemic, where, as Professor Carlisle pointed out, people are looking back to when times were a little bit better or a little more certain, that healer-in-chief role. So I think Joe Biden does bring that to the table and is really benefited from having stepped away and having a 4-year gap between his run.
Good point. This is sort of a morbid question, but what happens if a person is elected president and dies before they're inaugurated? Has that ever happened in history? Does the Constitution have any sort of roadmap for that, Professor Carlisle?
Yeah, so I think, and again, Jim will know the specifics on this one. The shortest lived presidency it was the president who didn't wear his coat to the inauguration. But I think right now that's a really interesting question. Say, for example, Trump succumbs to COVID. Who are we voting for? Are we essentially voting for, like, a vote cast for Trump? Is that a vote cast for Pence? I imagine there's a lot of attorneys right now who are trying to figure this out, given the circumstances. And I don't think it's morbid. I think there's some good realism to that, right? That this is a potential outcome. And so people want to be prepared. People want to know the answer to that. I don't think there's a clear answer as far as I know, but Jim has probably the data on that.
There are semi-clear answers. Juliet's right. There are no super clear answers because while we have supposed procedures in place to deal with these things, very few of them have been fully tested. Part of that, we've had presidential candidates die and vice presidential candidates die at different points in the electoral cycles, but it turned out every single one of them was a losing candidate, and so it ended up irrelevant. You had Horace Greeley die after the election in 1872, but before the Electoral College met, but he lost anyway. The Democratic vice presidential candidate the Democratic presidential candidate in 1920 died after Election Day. The vice presidential candidate for the Republicans in 1912 died before Election Day, but all of these were losers. And so in the end, it was just like, oh, well, it's not a big deal because they lost anyway. The real key that this comes down to of what happens has so much to do with when does a candidate die? So if Donald Trump were to die of the coronavirus before Election Day, or if Joe Biden were to die for any reason before Election Day, the expectation is, and the procedure that's generally in place, is the party committee is supposed to meet and pick a new nominee. And the expectation is that any ballots cast for that ticket's nominee, regardless of what it says on the ballot, should count, though there would be legal challenges on that effect. If one of the candidates dies after Election Day, but before the Electoral College meets, technically the Electoral College electors are supposed to be able to vote for whoever they want, though there's some state laws that would penalize them for doing so, but they can still do so and just accept the penalties, though you might expect that under such extreme circumstances, states wouldn't penalize them for not voting for a dead person, which they are constitutionally not allowed to do. But say Joe Biden or Donald Trump passed away after Election Day, you would expect the electors simply to vote for their vice presidential nominee and elevate that person to the presidency and pick someone else to be vice president. The really tragic, it's tragic if someone dies, but the really troubling moment is if a winning presidential candidate dies after the Electoral College votes, but before Congress counts the votes. Because now you're in a situation where there is no historical precedent, where there's all sorts of rules about who the House and the Senate can vote for. And it's supposed to be people who were top 3 or top 5 finishers in the Electoral College. And if there's only 2 finishers and one of them's dead, you can basically only vote for the one that's living or refuse to vote, which can get you into all sorts of circumstantial problems about who becomes president. And we would need a very long time to work out all the possible routes you go down. So really the long story short is you really don't want a presidential nominee to die, not only because they're a human being and we shouldn't want anyone to die, but because it's a very messy process, in part because of the way our presidential elections are run.
And this was a question well before the coronavirus diagnosis of President Trump last week. I mean, just based on the age, I think that has sort of cast some more pressure on the vice presidential candidates, just because these are 2 men who are, in their mid to upper 70s, right, Boyd?
Yeah, that's right. And I think all of that is putting a lot of eyes right here on the University of Utah in Salt Lake City for the next few days. I know I have. I started at 4:30 this morning, and people are very interested in what's going to happen here in this debate, because again, there is a possibility, and whether it's between now and the election, or whether it's over the course of the next 4 years, right. There still is a possibility, again, just given age and circumstance, that one of the 2 vice presidential nominees could end up being the occupant of the Oval Office. And so again, how they think, what they think, how they approach things is top of mind for everyone around the country.
Boyd, sorry, Professor.
I was just going to say, add to that, not only that, but given the circumstances of health right now with one of the candidates, the vice presidential debate might be the last debate before, the end of the election, before November 3rd. So I think there's particular attention on the vice presidential debate than you might normally expect. Usually it's sort of, something that's done, but I think there's probably going to be a lot more attention to the VP debate for a couple of reasons.
It's really important. I mean, again, back to the brief statistics I shared, 8 vice presidents have become president when a president died. And I think we take that for granted because it hasn't happened since the 1960s. So it's been a while. And so we get this sort of complacency that, well, the president, that's something that used to happen, but it doesn't happen anymore. Well, people used to think that about a lot of things. People used to think that, well, you didn't have these situations where one candidate won the popular vote and the other candidate won the electoral college, because it didn't happen from the 1880s until 2000. These things can happen, which is why people should pay attention to who the vice presidential candidates are and what they have to say, because they have a high chance, apparently a 30% chance of becoming president, either because the president dies or because they run for president later. And so these are important people who may be leading the government, and we should want to know what they have to say, and we should want to see how they perform on a national stage.
I want to get to the debate and what you guys expect from the candidates this week. But this question first: does the vice president have influence over foreign policy, and does it differ for each VP? I'm assuming that means fast forward a general question, and then the VP policies that we know of on foreign policy. Does anyone want to take a stab at that one?
Yeah, I mean, I can address that. You talked earlier, sort of at the top of the hour, about some of the reasons why VPs are chosen. In particular, they might be chosen for their experience in a particular area. And indeed, when Obama chose Biden, one of the reasons why he chose Biden was because Biden's extraordinarily long history in foreign policy. That's something that Obama didn't have a huge strength in. So certainly vice presidents can have a significant role in foreign policy, and it can vary from president to president.
Other comments on that question?
No, I think just adding to that, you can go through and see some pretty significant. I think over the last 2 administrations, you saw where you had younger presidents in George W. Bush and Barack Obama, and they both chose older, more foreign policy experienced candidates to be their vice president. And so that's an interesting trend. Of course, you had Lyndon Johnson with John F. Kennedy, again, kind of similar, older stability experience brought to a youthful ticket. This year, we're kind of seeing the flip of that just a little bit, but it's going to be interesting to see how that happens moving forward, because then you had, in 70s, 80s, and 90s, you really had this more statesman experienced top of the ticket, where the vice president really didn't have to carry the water in terms of experience in foreign policy. So it'll be interesting to see how that continues to play out.
And if you sort of look at the counterfactual, if Hillary Clinton had been elected, she had an extraordinary amount of foreign policy experience. So she would probably have driven that train.
Yeah.
That's a good point. Okay, let's see. Another question. Fast forward to this week. In what ways will the vice presidential debate differ from the first presidential debate we saw last week? Oh boy. I think people kindly say it's raucous. Others say, wow, that was real chaos. How do you think things are going to play out on the debate stage here at the University of Utah? Professor Kirk?
Sure. Most vice presidential debates have been very collegial. There are exceptions to that. The 1992 vice presidential debate featuring Al Gore and Dan Quayle and James Stockton was notably raucous. It's probably the most similar debate to what we just saw a week ago in Cleveland, in terms of candidates yelling over each other. But then you add into that James Stockton basically being like, who am I and why am I here type situation. That's a joke for all the people who remember 1992. Not most of the students watching. But generally, they've been very collegial, and they've been noted for that. Part of that's the format. They have them sit down at a table, and I think that brings a different level of collegiality to it. Part of it's because they're not the top of the ticket, so they don't have that same heat placed upon them. But that's generally been the case, and I think you have to expect that that's the case this time, just because it'd be hard to imagine a universe in where Kamala Harris and Mike Pence yelled at each other more and interrupted each other more than we saw with Donald Trump and Joe Biden. But it's like with the exception of that 1992 debate, vice presidential debates have been very low key, very collegial, and often more policy oriented than the presidential debates themselves. Sometimes you get a better sense of what the ticket actually plans to do on policy from the VP debate than you do from many of the presidential debates that we've had in American history.
Professor Carlisle?
Yeah, I think, when we take a look at who these two individuals are, Pence is very regulated. He's very clean and practiced, and he has a very different style than President Trump. President Trump is no debater, and Pence is, and I think he will adhere to the rules. And Kamala as well will adhere to the rules. So I think you're going to see a much more refined and respectful debate than what we saw last week.
Boyd, in terms of messages, what is the content that we can expect to hear on Wednesday?
Yeah, as has been mentioned, I think it will be much more of a policy discussion, which is really interesting because I think they will probably lay out better than the presidential debates what the first 100 days or what the first 500 days of an administration will look like in terms of policy. I think they'll have some exchanges. They'll go back and forth to be sure. We always forget what the vice presidential debates do. If you just look back 4 years, Tim Kaine and Vice President Pence, it was Tim Kaine who was the attacker and the interrupter. And it didn't play, knowing Tim Kaine, it didn't play well because it wasn't really natural to him. But he came in with a set of orders. Often the vice presidential choice is the attack dog for the ticket. And Tim Kaine really went hot on that. And Mike Pence played off of it, ignored a lot of it, and stayed on message. And so that's kind of an interesting thing, just looking back just 4 years ago. But I don't see that happening this time. I think Kamala Harris will do something interesting. I think she will poke and prod a little bit, both at the president and the administration, but I think she will make the important pivot to what are we for? One thing the American people are exhausted by, they know what you're against. They know you're against the other side. They know you're against their policies and what they've done in the country. But what the American people want to know, the pivot, is the most important part of the debate. And that is, can you pivot to what you are for? What is your positive vision? What is your message? What are your principles and policies to actually move the country forward?
It's interesting. Kamala Harris is known as an attack dog. She is a very aggressive debater. Will she rein herself in just based on what we saw last week? Will she say, oh, the polls show that Americans did not like that kind of crosstalk, that kind of aggression? Do you think last week is going to affect the way she will approach her own debate? Any thoughts there?
I think as a prosecutor, she understands the art of the hands of steel in velvet gloves, and I think you'll see a lot of that. You'll see some sharp contrasts and some sharp. She will be the prosecutor, but I think she'll do it with a light touch and a forward-looking vision. Not just attacking the president, not just doing the one-liners from that you would use, the red meat stuff from the campaign trail. I think she'll have a light touch to that. That will be a conversation moving, I think, is the goal for her.
There's another gender layer there, right, Professor Carlisle? I mean, there are certain expectations of women that differ from men.
Absolutely. And going back to what Boyd said about Tim Kaine, one of the reasons why he came out fiercely is because he can do it and Hillary Clinton couldn't. Being a white man, there's certain privileges and expectations of behavior that aren't bestowed upon women. A woman has to balance being assertive but not aggressive, and it's a very fine line for women to be knowledgeable but not arrogant. Another fine line, and so it's tricky for a woman, and especially a Black woman, a woman of color, because there's those tropes about angry Black, women. There's biases that people hold. And so they'll view perhaps her assertiveness through this lens of gender and race. And so it's a hard task, but Kamala has done very well in the Senate, as Boyd had mentioned. You know, she can deliver an attack in such a smooth way that you almost like don't know what came by and hit you, because she's so smart and capable with her background, that she's really good at it.
Anything to add, Professor Curry?
No, I don't have anything to add. I think that's really good coverage between Boyd and Juliet.
Okay. Well, we've only got a few minutes left. I guess I'd like to hear from each of you, and we touched on this a little bit earlier, just about the future of the vice presidency, how 2020 is really going to, or could potentially reshape the notion of this office. And Professor Curry, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I don't actually expect that this election reshapes the notion of the office. I think what we've seen since the 1970s is an increasingly empowered vice president, in the sense that, again, pre-Jimmy Carter, vice presidents were kept at about as far of an arm's length as possible by their president, in part because often they were sort of afraid of their political ambitions, or because they didn't necessarily trust this person. It wasn't someone that they necessarily had a professional working relationship with prior to entering the White House very suddenly. Since Carter, that's changed, and you have more of a partnership. And we've seen this just become increasingly so over time, with presidents since then entrusting portions of their agenda and portions of the government to be overseen largely by the vice president, by treating the vice president as one of the top advisors in the White House. And I think that's what you're going to continue to see. Now, the only thing that 2020 adds, which is very specific for the moment and not necessarily for the long run, is that with two very old presidential nominees, we're in a situation that we haven't seen in a long time, where there's a higher likelihood than usual of one of them becoming president in the next 4 years. And I think that's really time bound, because that doesn't say anything about the future, because we could easily have young nominees again in 2024 or 2028. But for 2020 specifically, and for the coming presidential administration, that adds even more, which could make things very complicated, in that whoever wins the presidency may be looking over their shoulder a little bit more than we've seen as of late, or have really that we haven't seen that since at least the Clinton administration, where it seemed towards the back end that Clinton was kind of looking over his shoulder at Gore, who clearly had presidential ambitions for 2000.
Boyd Matheson?
You know, I think it'll be fascinating to see how it does continue to evolve. And again, younger candidates, older candidates, that tends to ebb and flow as we go down the decades. I do think it's interesting, too, as we look at that role. I do think the two current vice presidential candidates are going to be part of shaping what the vice presidency looks like for decades to come. And I actually think the debate we're going to see this Wednesday is actually going to be a preview of coming attractions. Because regardless of who wins on the first Tuesday of November, both of these candidates will be around in 2024. So this could well be a preview. I also think it will be very interesting to see, again, as it relates to the vice presidency and these candidates specifically, do they take some of the cues of where they are this week in terms of Utah? We're a country at a crossroads, and there's a lot to be learned from where we are in terms of a good free market economy, strong institutions of civil society, and lots of issues still to deal with in terms of race and addiction and opioids and depression and homelessness and air quality. So I think those are all going to come together in this debate. And I think those will be things that future vice presidents are also going to grapple with in terms of staking out a space for the vice presidency in policy and the future of the country.
Professor Carlisle, you get the last word.
So I think one of the interesting things is which ticket wins. And I think the role of the vice president will certainly be different depending on which ticket is victorious. I don't imagine if Trump and Pence are reelected to see any sort of about face in the way that Trump governs. He's somebody who doesn't necessarily like to share the spotlight. And I don't see that changing. However, if we see a Biden and Harris ticket win, I think what we'll see is a real partnership, as was stated before. I think Biden was a real partner with Obama, and I think that's really what he was looking for. And we have several unfolding crises. We have the pandemic, we have climate change, and we have, racism, Black Lives Matter issues that are really unfolding and gaining the attention of the American public. And if those are things that a Biden-Harris ticket deal with, I can imagine Kamala Harris taking a steady and a big role in those.
Well, thanks for setting the table for Wednesday's debate. Looking forward to it. And thanks for all the great questions from the students. Thanks to the Hinckley Institute of Politics. We'll all be watching on Wednesday to see how this plays out. But thanks so much. Take care.
Thank you.